So we're diving deep into something you've been wanting to explore for a while, the Jewish roots of the Eucharist. And you've given me some fascinating material to work with, like Brant Pitre's book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, and a bunch of articles.
Yeah, it's really amazing to think about how the Eucharist, it wasn't just something brand new, right? It actually developed from like centuries of Jewish tradition and expectation.
So it's less of a sudden invention and more like a tapestry, kind of woven from like threads of the Old Testament and all the hopes of the Jewish people.
That's a great way to put it. And when you understand those threads, you really start to grasp the depth of meaning behind the Eucharist, especially how central it is to your faith.
So where do we even start unraveling these threads?
The best place to start is the foundation, right? Jesus' Jewish identity. It might seem obvious, but it's crucial to remember that Jesus was born of a Jewish mother, raised Jewish, and lived entirely in a Jewish world. Like, all his actions and teachings only make sense in that context.
It makes me think of something Pope Benedict XVI said about understanding Jesus. He said that it requires understanding his Jewish roots, or we risk completely misunderstanding him.
He was spot on. Without that foundation, anything we build is on shaky ground. So a really key concept to understand here is the Jewish hope for a new Exodus. You see, many Jews back then believed in a future event that would echo the liberation from Egypt.
So they were longing for a repeat of that incredible moment in their history.
Yeah, but it went even deeper than just returning to the Promised Land. They envisioned a complete renewal, a new covenant, a new temple, even a new Promised Land that was more spiritual than physical. And this was a powerful hope that shaped their understanding of the Messiah.
And one of these articles mentions ancient rabbis teaching that God would rain down manna from heaven again during the Messianic age, just like he did during that first Exodus. It really shows how deep this yearning for God's miraculous provision ran.
Absolutely, and that longing really finds its fulfillment in Jesus. You see, think about his miracles, like turning water into wine at Cana. It echoes Moses turning water into blood, and his words often echoed those prophetic promises of a new covenant.
It's like he was deliberately using those images and themes from the Exodus to get his message across.
Exactly. Remember when he was asked if he was the Messiah, what did he do? He quoted Isaiah's prophecy about the blind seeing and the lame walking. Very Exodus-like imagery.
So he wasn't shying away from those expectations at all. It's like he was leaning right into them. I mean, do you think he saw himself as fulfilling this deeply ingrained hope for a new Exodus?
Now, that's a question worth thinking about. But to really dig into that, we need to shift our focus to the Passover connection, because we can't appreciate the significance of the Last Supper without first understanding the traditional Passover meal and its meaning.
You mean with the unblemished lamb and the blood on the doorposts, the eating of the flesh, all those powerful symbols pointing to deliverance from death?
Exactly. And one detail that really struck me from Patri's book was that the Israelites ate the Passover lamb the same night it was killed. There's this powerful sense of immediacy there.
It really puts you right there, highlights the urgency. Like, they were right on the verge of escaping slavery and death.
Yes, and when we look at the Last Supper, we see undeniable parallels with the Passover meal. We have an evening meal, the unleavened bread, and a clear focus on Jesus as the lamb who would be sacrificed.
But it wasn't simply a repeat of the traditional Passover, right? Pitre argues that Jesus actually instituted a new Passover with himself as the lamb.
That's a key insight. And most scholars believe that Jesus didn't drink the final cup of Passover wine, connecting it instead to his death on the cross. Like, this merging of the old and new rituals adds a whole other layer of depth to what he was doing.
So, he was building upon the foundation of the Old Covenant, but simultaneously ushering in something entirely new, almost like a bridge between the old and the new. Speaking of foreshadowing, I'd love to explore the symbolism of the manna and the bread of presence. Can you remind me about the significance of the manna from heaven in the Exodus story?
Of course. The manna was that supernatural bread that sustained the Israelites during their difficult journey through the wilderness. It was a physical sign of God's provision and care for his people. It's fascinating. Even the ancient rabbis debated the manna's origin.
Yeah, some thought it was just a natural substance, while others insisted it was truly miraculous. Sounds like the discussions we have today about the Eucharist.
You're right, it does echo those debates. And then we have this even more mysterious bread of presence from the Old Testament tabernacle and temple. This bread symbolized God's presence dwelling among his people. It was treated with incredible reverence.
And Pitre mentions this incredible detail, that priests would actually lift the bread of presence and say, "Behold God's love for you." It really gives me chills.
It's an incredibly powerful image, right? So if the manna foreshadowed a new manna in the Messianic age, could the bread of presence have foreshadowed a new, more accessible presence of God?
And could that be the Eucharist? That's really making me think. But was everyone immediately on board with this idea?
You've hit on a crucial point. Even in the Gospels, not everyone readily accepted this teaching about eating his flesh and drinking his blood.
It's true. Even Jesus' own disciples struggled with his words. Imagine hearing that for the first time. It must have sounded like cannibalism. It's no wonder many abandoned him after that.
It was a really difficult teaching, even for those closest to him. But for those who chose to stay, there were two keys to unlocking the mystery: Jesus' divine identity and the resurrection.
Okay, let's unpack those. What do you mean by Jesus' divine identity?
Well, he was making claims that no ordinary man could make, claiming to be one with God the Father, to have power over life and death. This wasn't just a rabbi speaking. It was God himself.
And how did the resurrection help them understand this difficult teaching?
Well, think about it. He was telling them that he was going to ascend to heaven, right? But then return in a new way. This meant that his presence in the Eucharist wouldn't be limited by his physical body. Like, he'd be present in a way that transcended time and space.
It really is mind-blowing when you think about it like that.
It truly is. We've talked about the manna, but how about this bread of presence? What does it have to do with the Eucharist?
That's a great question, actually. Fill me in.
Remember, the bread of presence was kept in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, right? And later, in the temple in Jerusalem, it symbolized God's presence dwelling among his people, and it was treated with immense reverence.
Okay, but how does that connect to what we're talking about? To the Eucharist?
Remember how we talked about Jesus seeing himself as ushering in a new exodus, a new covenant? Well, if there was a new exodus, wouldn't there also be a new bread of presence, a new manifestation of God's presence among his people?
Ah, I see where you're going with this. But the bread of presence was just bread, right? It wasn't literally God.
That's true, but it pointed to something beyond itself. It was a visible sign of an invisible reality. And isn't that exactly what the Eucharist is?
So just as the manna foreshadowed the Eucharist, the bread of presence foreshadowed the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
Exactly. It's a beautiful progression, a deepening of the mystery. And remember that detail from Petrie's book about the priests saying, "Behold, God's love for you," when they lifted the bread of presence.
Yes, it's amazing.
Yeah, it suggests that even in the Old Testament, there was a sense that God's presence in the tabernacle was a manifestation of his love for his people.
And now, through the Eucharist, we have an even more direct and intimate encounter with that love.
Precisely. The Eucharist isn't just a static symbol. It's a participation in the sacrifice of Christ, the Lamb of God. It's his body and blood given for our salvation. And speaking of signs, those Eucharistic miracles we sometimes hear about, they seem to provide tangible evidence for the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Something that's hard to explain away as just symbolism.
Absolutely. Miracles like the one in Lanciano, Italy, where the host and wine visibly transformed into flesh and blood. Scientists have studied them. They offer compelling evidence for the truth of transubstantiation.
And what is transubstantiation? It is the change of the substance of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. The outward appearances or accidents of bread and wine remain, but their essence or substance is transformed into Christ himself.
It makes you wonder what it must have been like for those first disciples. I mean, we've been talking about all this, but let's not forget that some of Jesus' followers actually abandoned him after he gave this teaching on the Eucharist.
You make an excellent point. It shows that even for those who knew Jesus personally, this teaching was really hard to accept. It pushed them to the limit of their understanding.
I can imagine. To eat his flesh and drink his blood, it sounds so literal.
It does, and I think that's why many turned away. They couldn't grasp the spiritual reality that Jesus was revealing.
If it was so difficult for them, why didn't Jesus soften his language, make it more palatable?
Because he was speaking the truth. He refused to compromise the mystery of his presence in the Eucharist. Jesus knew that true faith requires a willingness to accept even those things that seem impossible to our human understanding.
And this brings us back to those two keys you mentioned, Jesus' divine identity and the resurrection. Those who stayed with him, who embraced this teaching, despite how difficult it was, they must have had a deep understanding of who he truly was.
Absolutely. They understood that he wasn't simply a wise teacher. He was the Son of God, the Messiah. They also understood that death wasn't the end for him. He would rise again, and his presence in the Eucharist would be a participation in his resurrected life.
It really makes you appreciate the faith of those who chose to remain. They clung to Jesus even when his words were scandalous, and even when it cost them the support of their community.
Their faith is a true inspiration for us as we continue to grapple with the mystery and beauty of the Eucharist.
It really is. This deep dive has been incredibly illuminating. It's like you've opened a door for me to see the Eucharist in a whole new way, especially its deep connection to my Jewish roots. But there's one more piece of the puzzle I want to explore.
Okay, tell me about it. What else have you been pondering?
It's this whole idea of the 4 cups of wine at the Passover meal. Petrie makes a really compelling case that Jesus intentionally didn't drink that 4th cup and connected it instead to his death on the cross. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's one of those details that you can easily miss, but it's so insightful once you understand the significance. The 4 cups of wine and the Passover Seder, they represent different aspects of the Exodus story, right? Liberation, deliverance, redemption, and finally, praise.
So by choosing not to drink that 4th cup, was Jesus saying that he hadn't fully completed his mission yet? Like there was still work to be done?
It's a really fascinating interpretation. It's as if he was saying, my work isn't finished. I still have to offer myself as the final sacrifice.
And then on the cross, when he said, "It is finished," could that be seen as him finally drinking that 4th cup, the cup of praise, after accomplishing redemption?
It's a powerful image. His death on the cross, it becomes the culmination of the new Exodus, the ultimate act of redemption. And the Eucharist becomes our participation in that sacrifice, our sharing in that cup of salvation.
We've talked about the Eucharist being foreshadowed in the Old Testament, but the Passover meal itself was meant to be a memorial, right? A way of remembering and reliving the events of the Exodus. So wouldn't that make the Eucharist also a kind of memorial?
You're exactly right. The Eucharist becomes a memorial of Christ's sacrifice, a way of making his death and resurrection present for us here and now.
It's not just remembering something that happened a long time ago, but encountering the living Christ in a tangible way.
Precisely. He's made present in the bread and wine, offering himself to us as the true bread of life. It's amazing to see how all these Old Testament symbols and stories, they find their fulfillment in Christ, and how he invites us to participate in this mystery.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the Eucharist, especially its roots in Jewish tradition. It adds a whole new dimension to my faith.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, this is really just the beginning. There's always more to discover about the richness of our faith.
That's true. You've really opened my eyes to see these connections between the Old and New Testaments, and I'm eager to keep exploring. Thank you for being such a fantastic guide on this journey.
It's been my pleasure, and may your continued reflection on the Eucharist lead you to an even deeper appreciation of God's love and presence in your life.
And to you, dear listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Jewish roots of the Eucharist. I hope this episode has given you a renewed sense of wonder and awe at this sacred mystery, the one that lies at the heart of our faith. We invite you to continue to explore this profound connection and to allow the Eucharist to nourish and sustain you on your own journey of faith.